Okay, so as I was preparing for today, I was a little nervous because Saint Leopold is the type of saint who had a very quiet and almost a hidden presence while he was on earth. And when you first learn about him, it can be hard to grasp exactly what was so great about him. But I'm just so inspired by him. The more I learn about him, the more inspired I am. And what first drew me to him was really seeing an image, a photograph of him. So I just wanted to take like a minute or so, and I'm just going to flip through some photos of St. Leopold just so that we can just sort of look at him, because really this is what initially drew me to him. I saw his photograph on the cover of a book. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to quietly sort of flip through some photos for you guys to see. Okay, so I think probably one of the things that stands out when you see Father Leopold, sorry, that's my washing machine making that noise. One of the things that probably stands out is his stature. And yet, everything that I've ever read about Father Leopold, people inevitably use the term spiritual giant. So we're looking at someone who is he was only about 4'5" or 4'6". And I'm so inspired by him because the more that I study his life and read about him, I'm just convinced that he was a near perfect example of pretty much every Franciscan value. He was a Capuchin, and the Capuchins specifically reference prayer, fraternity, and minority. And there's so much that I could talk about today, but what I specifically wanted to talk about is St. Leopold and Franciscan minority. Minority can be defined in various ways, but often an easy and simple way to think about it is littleness, or seeking to serve rather than be served. Sometimes it's said that the external expression of minority is poverty, and the internal expression of minority is humility. And I believe that Father Leopold, St. Leopold, he really was almost a near perfect example of both poverty and humility. As a child, St. Leopold experienced poverty because his family was a merchant family in Dalmatia, which is now part of Croatia. They initially were quite prosperous, but they lost everything. And so he didn't just grow up poor, but he actually became poor, materially poor. And I think that was a seminal experience for him. And then at the age of 16, he presented himself at a Capuchin friary, and he voluntarily embraced the radical poverty of the Capuchins. And as you know, the Capuchin reform one of the hallmarks was a return to the radical poverty of St. Francis. So he had experienced becoming poor and then voluntarily embraced the life of really radical poverty. Sometimes when we talk about Franciscan minority, people use terms like downward movement or downward direction, downward tendency. And I really believe that God firmly impressed this way of viewing the world in St. Leopold's heart. One, through his own physical experience of his physical body, and then also through the experiences of his daily life. So as I said, he was only about 4'5". One beautiful story recounts how he had to use a step stool to retrieve the Blessed Sacrament from the tabernacle. And I just find that to be such a beautiful thing to imagine in my mind. But he was often taunted by children and even by other friars about his height. And I often think that throughout his entire life, even as a grown man, he always had to look up at people. You know, he was 4'5". So I just think that that gave him a real appreciation and a love for those who are cast down, because in his own experience, that is how he viewed the world from that vantage point. He was also born with really poor eyesight, and he struggled with that throughout his life. But he was a scholar, and he struggled for hours and hours to read the doctors of the church. He wanted to soak up everything about what the church taught. He also suffered from a speech impediment, a stutter or a stammer. And some people say that he was only able to speak softly, or that his speech was very laborious. And because he was so brilliant, he had such a brilliant mind, he dreamed of being a preacher, but his superiors just never assigned him those types of duties because they just felt that his speech impediment would be in the way. Another thing that he struggled with all of his life was chronic arthritis. And if you look in this photo, his fingers, you can see how they're gnarled. And in many of his photographs, his hands would always be clenched in a fist because it was so painful for him to even just straighten out his fingers. And the arthritis caused him, even from an early age, to walk with an unusual gait, which further drew attention to him. But as he got older, he became really stooped over and had to use a walking stick. He also had chronic stomach and other ailments that affected his esophagus, and that's ultimately what he died from, was cancer of the esophagus. People who knew St. Leopold always describe him as being meek and humble, but he himself said that he had a really bad temper and that he had to work every single day to control his temper. When he first went to the Capuchin friary, the friars would try to assist him with everything because they saw that he had what they perceived to be limitations. And several times he just had these outbursts of temper because he didn't want to be helped. But he made a vow to learn to control his temper. And he succeeded, because after that brief period in his early life in the friary, everyone who described him after that point always described him as being humble and meek. Father Leopold, although he was Dalmatian or Croatian, he spent most of his life in Italy. You can see him here in the photo. So that, for the most part, in all of the friaries where he was assigned, he was the only non-Italian and usually the only Croatian or Dalmatian. So I also think that God allowed him to have this experience also as an ethnic minority amongst all of these Italian friars. In this photo, you can see him pictured with one of the families who dearly loved him. And as you can see, he's basically the same height as the children in the family. And again, I think this was another way that God allowed him to constantly place himself in the position of minority. You know, the word minority is in the name of the Order of Friars Minor. And so this was something that is a hallmark of the Franciscans, especially the First Order. And yet, out of everything that I've read about Father Leopold, he never once called attention to his own, what we might consider limitations. They really allowed him to have just more and more compassion for people in similar situations. And he never rested. He said that he believed that a priest should die in the work of the apostolate. Every moment of his life was spent helping people. He visited hospitals, he visited the sick, he visited the poor. Any concern that the poor brought to him, no matter how small it was, whether it was, oh, I need a piece of fabric to make my child a garment, he would take all of their concerns to heart, and he, in his own way, would find a way to bring about a solution to whatever the problem was. But it was really in the confessional where Father Leopold really showed his heroic nature. Because of what his superiors perceived to be his limitations, they assigned him to the confessional. I've been to his cell in Padua, where he spent almost 40 years in a tiny little cell. It was like 4 feet by 6 feet. And the friaries at that time were very austere. So his cell was freezing in the winter. It was burning hot in the summer. And he once said that he was like a bird in a cage, but that he did it gladly. He's been called a martyr of the confessional. But for Father Leopold, being assigned to the confessional was actually an answer to a prayer that he made when he was 8 years old. So when he was 8 years old, he committed some small infraction, and his sister marched him to the local parish, and the parish priest made him kneel in the middle of the church for like an hour or something. And St. Leopold said, I stayed there deeply saddened and wondering within myself, why treat so severely a child for such a slight fault? When I get big, I want to be a religious, a confessor, and treat the souls of sinners with much goodness and mercy. So his prayer as an 8-year-old was definitely answered. In fact, in 2016, during the Jubilee Year of Mercy, Pope Francis asked that the relics of 2 saints famous for their ministry in the confessional be brought to St. Peter's Basilica. One was St. Padre Pio, and he's very well known, and his ministry in the confessional is very well known, also a Capuchin, but also St. Leopold, who also gave so much of his life in the confessional. When you read the accounts of his penitents, they all say that he was very gentle and courteous to everyone who came into his cell. And he often had the ability to read people's souls, and he would even name the sins to be confessed before the penitent had a chance to name the sins. And what's amazing to me too is that in everything I've read, there are many accounts from his penitents. No one ever said that they had a hard time understanding him, even though he had a speech impediment. It doesn't seem that his poor eyesight, kept him from being a great confessor. And definitely all of his work as a scholar, all of his studies assisted him in providing good counsel to all of his penitents. He would often assign his penitents very light confessions. He would say, put it on my shoulders and I'll take care of it. So he might have them recite a decade of the rosary, but then he would stay up all night praying for all of his penitents. He would take the bulk of the penance onto himself. And other friars even criticized him for that. They said, oh, you're too lenient with your penitents. And Father Leopold would respond, I learned to be merciful from Christ. And he would point at a crucifix and say, and yet Christ gave even more than I haven't yet died for sinners. So he felt that it was his job to bring the love and the mercy of Christ to everyone who came into his confessional. St. Leopold, he also had a great love for Our Lady, had a great devotion to her. And it plays into his final night on earth, or his final day on earth. The night before he died, he heard the confessions of 50 priests. Um, he was much sought after by priests as a confessor, and he often led spiritual retreats for the clergy. So he heard about the confession of about 50 priests, and then he stayed awake all night praying for them. And in the morning, very early, he was vesting for Mass, and he fainted. By this time, the cancer of the esophagus had become very painful, along with all of his other ailments. So he was taken to bed, and he received the sacrament of the sick. And then all of the friars gathered around his bed, and they all started to chant the Salve Regina. And in the final verse of the Salve Regina, O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary, he kind of reached his arms out, and as if he were moving towards something. And that was the moment when he passed away. The entire city of Padua, where he had lived for most of his life, came out to the funeral. The funeral was so large that it could not be held in the friary church. It had to be held, I believe, at the Basilica of St. Anthony, which is much larger. This is a photo of his confessional cell. And as you can see, it's very sparse. He always had fresh flowers in front of a portrait of Our Lady. But this is where he spent 10 to 15 hours a day for almost 40 years, hearing confessions, which I think is heroic. And another point that I really don't have time to go into fully today, but I just wanted to mention because it's a huge part of his story. Father Leopold believed that he had a mission from God to minister to what he called his people, meaning the people of Dalmatia, Croatia, that whole area of the world. He called it the East, obviously it's east of Italy. But his superiors would never allow him to go because of all these things that they perceived to be limitations, his health and so forth. But slowly through prayer, he realized that there was a way for him to accomplish that mission. And he made a vow, which he repeated very often throughout his life, that anyone who came into his confessional, he would treat as someone from the East, one of his countrymen, who he desperately wanted to be with them, but he was separated from them for his life. So what became bitter, being separated from them, became sweet for him. And it's evidenced in just the way that he treated everyone who came into his confessional with such gentleness. For him, each of those people was someone from the East, as he would say, from his homeland. Another interesting thing about his confessional cell, before the onset of World War II, Father Leopold predicted that there would be a terrible war, and he said that the entire friary and the friary church would be demolished. But he said that the little cell where he heard confessions would not be destroyed. And if you look in the picture, you can see sort of this line. So this section here with the window, that's the outside of his little cell. And the section of the building that's in brick, that's actually the new friary that was constructed around the cell. And his prediction bore out because the cell was not damaged at all. And he said that in this cell, God exercised so much mercy for people, it must remain as a monument to God's goodness. And there's even a little plaque there on the wall. If you go to the sanctuary in Padua, you can see it and you can go into the cell. It's really, really a moving experience. I just wanted to end with two of probably his most famous sayings. One is have faith. He would often say, especially when he was visiting the sick, which he did often, God is both doctor and medicine. And another saying that he would often use was, the mercy of God surpasses all expectations, that with our human minds, we can't quite grasp the wideness of God's mercy. So that's just a little introduction to St. Leopold. As I said, he's been such an inspiration in my life, and I just thought of a few questions that maybe people might want to respond to, or just to get us talking. So how do I embrace minority in my own life, meaning both poverty and humility, external minority and internal minority? How do I feel about being viewed as lesser by others? Does it bother me to think that someone might underestimate me or think of me as less than what I perceive myself to be? Do I embrace humility? Do I want God's will to be done, even when it conflicts with what I want? Do I find ways to accomplish the mission that God has given me, even when there are obstacles or setbacks? And then finally, the last one, which I've thought about a lot, how do I feel about my own imperfections? Sometimes we're so hard on ourselves that we don't think that maybe the things that we see as limitations or imperfections were actually put there by God to give us a certain experience, as they worked in Father Leopold's life. So that's all that I have. I'd be